Hey, I was working on editing this, and there's some laggy audio at some point in this video at a number of points, but just still enjoy what you can. There's nothing more American than freedom, and the CTMU says we have it, a whole lot of it. As we touched upon last week, we are crucially implicated in the universe's self-modeling, which by extension means that we are also implicated in the universe's self-generation. The self-generative freedom that is the provenance of ultimate reality is locally distributed to every point, instance, and object in reality. However, syntactors, once they reach a level of structural complexity that allows them to appropriately be called tellers, can reciprocate this freedom. They are not structurally modeled outwardly, but rather with the outside universe determining their shape and trajectory, but in some way they're modeled internally with their own self-model and free will determining their choices. So we'll get back to this later. I've gotten it down to a T with my theological argument for why free will is the case. I can prove it using the CTMU, which we'll go into. Premise one, God, the global operator descriptor, the God of ultimate reality, is externally undetermined and therefore entirely free. Nothing external to God determines God's choices because this would limit God's creative power and freedom. Premise two, human tellers are made in the image and likeness of God. In conclusion, human tellers are free. This seemingly simple argument holds up at the profound level of metaphysical discourse we explored. Freedom is not just a concept, but a crucial element in the self-identification of the universe, forming the essential basis of its existence. As my peer self-duality on YouTube, formerly Mathematical Metaphysics, suggests, the universe is locally confusing itself through projections of free will to attain a fuller and more complete understanding of itself. In essence, the ultimate reality system is engaging in a process of self-exploration through its secondary images, which are entirely undetermined. And this process allows us to live and make choices that contribute to the self-generative evolution of the reality system. Space is essentially infinitary concerning cognition, but it is backwardly finite concerning perception, meaning that any input from observer participants always terminates on a finitary point. So any secondary teller is essentially a finitary operator, a finite portion of the infinite creator that explores and structures itself through free will, serving thereby as an instrument for the self-knowledge of the God. What free will is the limit of the viewpoint. Because we are cognitively and perceptually bound in our finite world, we can't see the whole picture all of the time of what reality is trying to do. This leads to these local projections of confusion, whereby we deviate from the general utility of the reality system. Freedom, therefore, is the first distortion, so to speak, of ultimate reality. The universe is, in essence, one being that fractionates itself through these limited viewpoints for a more full self-knowledge. It exists not for itself, but for communion with the definite other, with the other who is free to reciprocate its gift, with these secondary images into which reality impresses its image. So the created universe is the universe's experience of itself through freedom and through free operators, and all manifestation is intimately bound up with this primordial self-exploration of which we are a part. Therefore, the most fundamental metaphysical drive is freedom. It creates and structures the universe by necessity. Reality is structured to bring about operators with free will who can participate in the structure and dynamics of reality and the ends of its self-identification. So many say that God is omniscient, but then go and separate the universe from his creatures. And so, however, under the full definition of omniscience, that would necessarily include what a knowledge of what it's like not to know everything, not to be omniscient. This can't just be a logical thing because self-identification is properly both logical and experiential. Therefore, the creator must exist as an entirely free class of entities within itself called secondary identification operators that have no idea who they are until they turn either inwards or completely outward and recognize their ultimate metaphysical identity. So the CTMU says, therefore, that even though we may have different wills and perspectives, we are correctly considered different aspects of the same ultimate identity that subtends all of existence, gives life to the world, and harmonizes all of our free wills into a shared reality. And it does this because it wants to know itself. To experience itself truly as the gift of the other is the purpose of reality. This is what we mean when we say logical and experiential self-identification. It is the self-knowledge of God through experience. We are the experience of infinite intelligence knowing itself. Therefore, the CTMU says that we are not chemical scum supervening on brute physical processes, but we are the process itself. We drive evolution. We are integral to the structure and dynamics of reality because reality is uniquely suited to our purposes. It takes our needs into account and satisfies them. There's only one being in reality, and that is the God. Each being is a sub-identity of the God with freedom of will, as the infinite creator expresses its curiosity about liberty. So is there anything more American than that? God, guns, freedom, and Chick-fil-A. The motto of the state to the north of me, live free or die, turns out to be a metaphysical axiom of the reality system, as it investigates the concept of free will through foci of telesis, structurally complex syntactors that are capable of mirroring the intelligent energy of the universe, called telors, serve further to structure and establish a pattern of natural laws, and a sublogos, so to speak, that is focused on the creative evolution of our universe toward the end of life and freedom. We are bipedal apes, which our sublogos chose to invest in with self-consciousness and this freedom of will in its plan to allow the creator to know itself. And as a result of our extreme free will, which is in some ways unusual among secondary tellers of our complexity due to the veiling of our subconsciousness and our deep mind, and thus our lack of awareness of this kind of primordial unity, we are thus able to consciously seek or choose a path back to the creator and have nothing externally compelling us to do this. We have entire freedom of will. God and his teleology are as freely rejected as they are accepted, as can be, readily seen in our world today. However, an appropriate analogy perhaps would not be that people with free will are imbeciles stumbling in a dark room, unaware of the light of the infinite creator. But as the famous Jewish rabbi Menachem Mendel Stierson said, rather we ought to think of secondary tellers as the light bulbs themselves. He said, do you see that light bulb? It is connected by wires to an electrical generating station that powers the whole of Brooklyn. And that plant is connected to turbo generators at Niagara Falls that power the whole state of New York and more. Every one of us is a light bulb wired into an infinitely powerful generator. But the room may still be dark because the connection has yet to be made, and it is hard to find a switch in the dark. We are directly connected to the greatest source of power and knowledge in existence, powerfully interdependent to every being in reality, because we are, in truth, one being. The job of divine guidance or inspiration is merely a matter of God configuring himself as your highest level of identity, taking your hand in that dark room and helping you find the switch. The path back to the creator is a matter of becoming more and more like what we already are, becoming like jewels in the crown of the creator, the free ones who have chosen true being. There's nothing more inspiring to God than his human servants. They're higher even than his angels, because we are local portions of God that have chosen him when it was so much easier to ignore him. Our choices on our journey back became structuring forces in existence, self-models of the penitent and true believer. Christopher Langan writes, eternal life belongs only to those who conform to the highest and most general level of the stratified identity.
The elect, the true metaphysical elite, becomes a crucial aspect of God, aiding in the very act of creation itself. This is the level of identity that is potentially shared by every one of us until, through hatred or contempt or sheer moral stupidity, we sever ourselves from it. True, free will allows for precisely this hatred, contempt, or ignorance of God, but it also allows for inspiring devotion and selfless service to the Creator, which would not be possible without true freedom. Because in the intelligent infinity because the intelligent infinity that God is has infinite possibilities, there is no ending to the manyness, no terminal point of God's self-exploration. If you don't get it by now, self-identification is the essential basis and purpose of reality. There is none else. Self-exploration continues infinitely in an eternal present, concretized in the relative perspective of each of its participants. Thereby, the CTMU brings into coincidence the two main models of determinacy, determinism and randomness. In the CTMU, randomness implies structurelessness and a lack of a backing, which is not true, and a lack of a pattern, which is not true of anything in reality. Everything is structured, everything is patterned, it's third. However, reality is not determined from the top down, but there are intermediate levels of causation that occur between, including but not limited to, telic identification in the creative evolution of life. So we're going to present this paper, and in this, Christopher Langan talks about how it's kind of a false dichotomy between these ideas of you know determinacy and randomness, is that actually the CTMU couples those and says that they're actually describing two aspects of the same thing. So I'm going to try to pull that up. Okay. So in this paper, what Langan is basically talking about is this dichotomy between determinism and randomness. And the CTMU kind of shatters that false dichotomy. And the reason why it does this is because essentially reality is determined, so to speak, without any pre-made plan, meaning that it is self-determining. It has degrees of freedom appropriate to its fractal structure at all levels. Because reality consists of all and only reality, it is a logical necessity that reality should be self-determining. And the mechanism by which it does this is the distributed degrees of freedom described here, terminating upon secondary telic identification operators such as human beings. However, there is a primordial freedom that is distributed to all objects, be all syntactors, not just tellers, that allows a certain flexibility for them, even though they can't quite model themselves or make choices, just in order to embody and properly express these higher order dynamics. So asserting total randomness is kind of silly because that would mean that events would have no connection to the past whatsoever. Whereas asserting total determinacy is similarly kind of dubious because that would mean that events are entirely controlled by the past. In the CTMU, according to self-determinacy, the present is a terminal moment in which the design and potential coming from the future, these intentions, interface with the laws and structure of present reality in order to bring about a new state, a new moment in being. And so therefore, the evolution of reality is not deterministic, but rather self-deterministic. It's telic because it embodies the intention of the primary and secondary tellers and is designed to take their needs into account and satisfy them. Reality is not determined by its laws, but rather its laws are mutually coupled with how reality evolves, meaning that reality can change its laws over time in order to account for new developments. We don't need either to connect the dots in a totally deterministic way or settle for random scattering, but rather we can allow the dots to draw themselves. Reality is built to draw its own picture, and its meaning is determined on the fly in coupling with its self-generative evolution. This is the only way that we can attribute credible meaning to reality. If it is meaningfully involved in its own story and determines its evolution through the sub-identities of its tellers. Therefore, we find our purpose and fulfillment in the satisfaction of the intrinsic purpose of reality, called generalized utility, um, which is what all self-determinacy is striving towards. It's not a specific end, but rather a general value to which reality strives. And it's basically self-identification, for reality to strengthen its identity through that metaphysical elite, through the elect who participate in the structure and dynamics of reality in a moral and ethical way. So this is why we say that the summit of earthly knowledge resides in the souls and minds of the righteous, because they are properly configured with respect to ultimate reality. And configuration and control of reality is how we define intelligence in the CTMU. So many of the most intelligent people, which you might find if you measured them with an IQ test, might actually be quite foolish under the CTMU definition, wherein intelligence requires a proper understanding of reality as well as an ethically mature way of living. Human experience and individuality as well are basically meaningless if we don't have free will, and we can't have free will without this model for self-determinacy. Intrinsic self-determinacy says that the effect of our choices is moved within the cause. We are self-modeling, and thus our choices are internal to us. They're not externally determined. Reality has an intrinsic self-determinacy in a general way, which means it doesn't need a blueprint or pre-existing laws and designs to bring itself into existence. It merely programs itself using this general drive or self-recognition, which then terminates upon, the creation of life, solar systems, galaxies, and so forth. But it didn't have any goal other than that self-recognition in the first place. So these are all essentially for the purpose of the self-identification of reality. There was no cosmic blueprint, so to speak, where every detail of evolution was laid out, because that would defeat, create, evolve, and thins the identity of reality by evolving separately from it, and thus its internal being through the representation of the physical world. Universe is the self-representation of freedom, because this freedom permeates every object, process, and relation within reality. Therefore, intrinsic self-determinacy can provide meaning for both the universe's cosmic and biological evolution, as well as our own lives, because it means that reality can determine its own meaning and implicate our own self-determination of purpose meaningfully therein. Because we are basically a sub-identity of ultimate reality with a localized projection of free will. This closed boundary also means that reality is capable of bringing itself into existence, because any explanatory structure that reality would have needed for its own genesis must be embedded within reality itself. Therefore, intrinsic self-determinacy is also a model of the reality principle and metaphysical ontology principles, which say that reality is self-creating, self-explaining, and self-sustaining. This is a logical implication of the free will of the reality system. Basically, the system calls on a generic form of its internal structure retrocausally, spawning itself into existence by its bootstraps, so to speak, using this generic level of existence to then program more concrete and refined levels of reality. And, these systems are not determined by one another, the syntax and state, but they're linked by this telic feedback whereby the one programs the other, meaning that syntax and state, or alternatively laws and their instances, are self-dual to one another and cannot be meaningfully separated in the final analysis. Therefore, reality bears description as a self-designing and self-determining system that serves to maximize reality's intrinsic value through the alternation and mutual refinement of syntax and state for the logical and experiential self-identification of the reality system. And through attributing existence to itself thereby, the system retroactively self-configures by applying the generalized utility function, saying that it would be more valuable for such and such to exist. And then it exists, so it works. Christopher Langan says thus about the ability of these closed systems to bring themselves into existence. He says, in effect, and this example of the closed system is the universe itself, is that he says, in effect, the system brings itself into existence. Let's see if we can find this. I don't know if I can see this, but Christopher Langan says, in effect, the system thus brings itself into existence as a means of atemporal communication between its past and future, whereby law and state, syntax and informational content generate and refine each other across time to maximize total systemic self-utility. This defines a situation in which the true temporal identity of the system is a distributed point of temporal equilibrium that is both between and inclusive of past and future. In this sense, the system is timeless or atemporal. Therefore, reality is beyond time. Time is internal to reality. Therefore, reality did not come into existence at any discrete moment in time, but rather had a distributed origin point as part of the state transition syntax of time itself, distributes over every single point in space and time. The process by which it does this is called telic recursion, but that is a story for another class. So if anyone would like to share, can anyone tell me what the CTMU says about freedom and free will? And then anyone can chime in with comments, questions, concerns. I think this should be a discussion. We were just discussing if anyone can tell me what the CTMU says about freedom, and then anyone can chime in with comments, questions, or concerns, or you can just, ask questions or write them in the chat concerning any of the things covered in this class or general questions about the CTMU.
Sure. I mean, free will, I think in the CTMU, I think you covered that, is come from the primary theory, from the origin, the very highest level where there's no external constraint. And then the system inherits inside of its component, its part, the tellers inherit of that initial freedom that comes from the lack of external constraint applied on the universe as it originates and self-configures and so on.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And so then why does it have to, why couldn't reality, obviously reality has to be self-determining, but why couldn't reality just fully determine the lives and choices of its secondary tellers? Like that's the claim of a lot of people, in Calvinism. The idea is that everything is just basically a simulation for the greater glory of God, and there's no free will or choices. So why can't that be the case?
I guess I'll go again, but I think it's because we bind telesis, so we partake in the creation, and so we're in a restricted image of God. We image of God with our local syntax, but I think that's the theory behind it. Since we also create this state syntax coupling that is abiding of telesis, then we also inherit of that freedom.
Yeah, exactly. So there would be no point for us to exist if there was none of this secondary telic feedback. There just wouldn't be a point of creating the universe, because there will be any information or value gained from it. Right. Two things that we can do with the remainder. Oh, internet connection is unstable again. I'll offer two things that we can do with the remainder of the time. Is we can either do more questions, or move into the next chapter in the CTMU, which is the future of reality theory according to John Wheeler. We can, whichever one people want.
Actually, when you say there's no point in having the centralized deterministic unfolding, I'm sure there's several aspects of why there's no point, but to me, why I think that's the case is because I don't see time, and I don't think why we would exist if there was just a perfect thing, because we see imperfections, so we see this refinement, but I don't have a good theoretical reason of why there would be no point for a perfect being to not have these segregators and configure the universe according to what they want, the self-utility locally generated. To me, it's more like almost an empirical point of if we went there, like there would be no point with time and our own experience if it wasn't the case. But I don't have a good theoretical way to think about this.
Yeah, I think basically the way that I think about this is if reality were entirely determined, there would be nothing separate from the ultimate identity. So there's no actual differentiation. When reality gets more interesting is when we have this perception, is when we have this finite perspective, this limit of the viewpoint on reality. And then reality gets to do something interesting, which is it takes these conscious agents, which are actually not in some way separate, or at least, severed from reality as a whole, and it gets to kind of locally confuse itself to see which operators work. And it's testing this out, and it's doing this logical and experiential self-identification whereby there is this more rich, vivid, and beautiful experience of the creator by itself. These operators with free will are basically supplying more information, and in so doing, they're almost like creating the universe, because that information is then that everything is structured to allow for that self-recognition. So if there were a design for a universe that were predetermined, it would basically be arbitrary, because it would have nothing to do with that general utility, which is the self-identification of reality. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
it does. But I'm still confused with why do you need to have a severed being to observe the universe, and why is it better that it's sort of partial and severed? That this is what defines sort of the utility rather than reality as a whole, let's say.
Yeah, is that there is a certain intrinsic utility to reality just existing, but reality determines that it actually strengthens and refines its value through this feedback, is that we are basically acting as God's eyes and ears on this earth. So for this kind of self-experience, is that if you think about it, if you didn't have these secondary operators, there would be literally nothing separate from itself. The entire reality system would be undifferentiated, unbound, unpotentiated. Nothing would happen. There would be no basically what calls forth this existence is this telic recursion, is that reality is taking this generalized utility, this drive to recognize itself, and out of this primordial chaos, it's extracting out a universe. So if you take away that drive, because that teleology is fundamentally connected to secondary tellers, then what you're doing is taking out all of the structure and patterns of the universe. You're basically giving it back to this like primordial randomness that has no bearing on like the actual universe. So Jacob says, is it that the SCSPL self-generates fractally, and this self-generation necessitates the stratification of self-determinism too? So yeah, so exactly. So the SCSPL, which is basically the operating language of this reality system, which also embodies it ontologically, so SCSPL is reality, it's this self-configuring, self-processing language that actually fractionates into these sub-languages. And the way that SCSPL reads itself is through these secondary tellers. So it has this input, it has this intention, but then you need this extension for that self-dual feedback, wherein the system gives existence and meaning to itself, right, through this like self-generative structure. So basically the SCSPL self-generates fractally. That's true, is that it's basically a fractal meta language. You can think about it. It's the SCSPL is a fractal meta language that reflects the structure of heaven and earth. And heaven, you can kind of think about as this like spirit world or non-terminal domain that is distributing programming over the reality system, over the terminal domain. And then the sub languages of SCSPL are actually human operators, is that it's N and T, which stands for tellers and syntactors. So reality quantizes itself in terms of the mu morphism, which is the grammar that attaches the GOD to its secondary images, in terms of the surface structure, which is the universe that we observe. But at the ultimate level, it quantizes itself in terms of the primary, secondary tellers and the tertiary syntactors, is that everything is kind of embodied by those three strata. So ultimately, I suppose you could say that the reason why reality needs this is the mu morphism for evolution. Remember, if you want a reality that evolves, which for whatever reason is preferable to a reality that is static, if you want this self-identification, you need evolution and you need meaning, and you can't do that in any way without intrinsic self-determinacy. And that also means that you can't do that without the mu morphism, is that you need this grammar that attaches God to his secondary images so that he can define and reinforce his identity. Otherwise, there's really no point in the universe. Is that the whole point, and it's not just humans, it's actually the entire system, but it's that there is this global identity which connects itself to local operators for the more full and complete knowledge and experience of the creator by itself. So that I think maybe scratches the surface of why we need these subsignatures, why we need tellers and syntactors, for instead of reality just being undifferentiated, unpotentiated oneness, is that it's actually a vastly preferable state for reality to create these secondary operators.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in a less formal sense, God is love, and so that requires an active participation with other beings.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I kind of referenced earlier in this is this is I talked in an interview with a guy, Telos Bound, and he kind of has this idea which is very CTMU adjacent, and he's acknowledged as such of this like communal ontology, is that basically it is the providence of ultimate reality to give itself in gift to the other. So there has to be that other for the gift to work. This is the classic Trinitarian idea of like lover, beloved, and love as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But you can think of that even simpler as just creator, creation, and creativity. Is that it's more interesting to have this trialic aspect to the way the universe represents itself than to basically just have unrelated and basically non-existent things, that you need this triality in order for reality to attribute existence to itself, and it wants to share its authority and share that love, that primordial drive to unitary identity. It's like reality is becoming two, it's splitting into the creator and creation, and these are something that are analytically separate as the intention and extension of reality, but they are united because the reason for that is for their ultimate union. So basically, the purpose of creation is for the creatures to return creation back to the creator as a gift of love. And that's basically the same thing as what I was saying before, and just kind of more visceral and emotional language. But that's basically the idea with self-identification, is that it's creatures returning the gift of creation to the creator, and then there's a more full and complete union and communion than there would be if there was never any gift or any difference at all.
I think a lot of people today still use the work of Spinoza to understand the world with a perfect God, and then it's still deterministic, but they believe we just don't know the reason we are observing creation, and we don't know the reason behind it. And would you say that the main thing that the CTMU brings, among other things, is like this embedment of evolution in the explanation of why there is these creatures. I think it's something that Spinoza didn't have in mind, and so why we have a perfect creator creating all this chain of evolution if it was not to embed the local terrors in the process of also creating and evolving with the creator.
Yeah, I think it goes back to this idea of diffusiveness of being, is reality's tendency to break, is that essentially in order for that original split to happen between creator and creation, God actually has to basically remove himself from the creation. There is this contraction wherein God allows for there to be these localized projections of free will, and basically all of the created universe is the self-representation of the gift of God's freedom. So but that causes basically everything to break apart. And the idea with that is that there is kind of all of these almost, is that everything, that original divine light that permeated all of being, that like unbound infinite light, actually is still concealed within all of the things of the material world, but you have to kind of bring it out. And so it might even look like a lot of that, like there's almost no good in reality, or or maybe even that there is more evil than good in reality. And that might be the case in a particular planet, for instance. But if you look at at a particular time, but if you look at everything from the alpha to the omega, from the beginning to the end of existence, what you'll find is that this is the perfect structure of reality and of existence, is that everything is perfectly structured such that we can make this the best of all possible worlds for every being within reality. Because in truth, the ultimate ontology, the ultimate study of being, is one of interbeing. It is that we are all, because we are essentially secondary images of the creator, we are all interconnected in ways that aren't discernible on this plane of existence. So the goal ultimately is to return all of those like sparks of light to this intelligent unity and intelligently organize around love and understanding. So basically is that God, it comes back to this idea that God is love. Everything comes back to that ultimately, because it is the desire for love, which requires two analytically distinct entities and a relationship or mapping between them. Basically, love is the idea of a shared identity, which doesn't make sense without both this synetic, this sameness, but also this difference phase, this diffionic phase of that relationship. So ultimately, we are, in essence, the creator, but also there is a very real distinction there, because we have this aspect where we are terminally incarnated as a being that is cognitively and perceptually bound. So God can't evolve without differentiation, because you can't, there's no at this like undifferentiated, unpotentiated level before creation, not temporally prior to creation, because this is before even time. So basically, logically before creation, if there's no differentiation, nothing happens. It's totally unpotentiated and unactualized. So basically, reality is totally static. There's nothing happening. So that's exactly right, is that we need to have a model of reality in which evolution and differentiation is part of this ultimate reality that is in essence still static and monic. So you have these two aspects where we both have this phase where all of reality is like this fixed manifold, but also there is this constant motion and commotion happening in reality, and all of these interpenetrating spheres of interexpansive domains that are actualizing the universe and creating it anew at every moment, according to, basically, you can think of everything in reality as not only the self-representation of freedom, but also the self-representation of God's love, because it is the way in which he shares his being with the world. And that's talked about in Psalms, in Psalm 145, King David writes, Sadiq Adonai b'chol darachav v'chasid b'chol ma'asav, which means righteous is and just is the Lord to all. Loving kindness, love, compassion is over all of his workings. And Tov Adonai lakol v'rahamav kol ma'asav, which means that good is God to all. Love, again, compassion is over all of the inner workings of God. So basically that means that all of reality, it doesn't just mean that God is loving, but that all of reality is the expression of God's love. And that's actually something deeper, because that allows for a full reconciliation of creation back to the creator. And that turns out to be basically the purpose of secondary telic identification operators. That kind of took a turn for the more theological and religious, which I'm okay with. But I don't know if anyone else had any other questions.
Yeah, I had a question. Regarding evil, can you work against your own self-determinacy such that you nullify it?
I think you can. Well, certainly you can at your higher levels of identity, because people work against God all of the time, and God is the highest level of our identity. So certainly there you can. I think with respect to what you're saying about, like, can you work against yourself? Basically, the way that I see it is that there's kind of this choice where you can either serve the narrow confines of yourself, and that is the rejection of the gift and the turning inwards. And this is one of the things that Telos Bound has talked about, is that is essentially the basis ontologically of evil, is that self-relation, is that closing oneself off from the ultimate identity of reality and from the shared communal nature of how being works. And then you also have the option for service to others and service to creators, that these are essentially two paths, is that you can serve others and you can serve the creator, and that is actually strengthening. You have one level of stratified identity on which you can serve other human members, and you are your seventh level of stratified identity is humanity, and then the eighth level of stratified identity is ultimate reality. So those are the two highest things. But basically the idea with stratified identity is you want to serve every part and aspect of the way that you've configured in this world. So that includes your community, your nation, your school, your workplace, whatever, your family, all of these things. And you have to kind of work to balance all of those. So to answer your question, you can ignore every single one of them. There are a lot of people who ignore their own well-being and totally, go the kind of monastic or ascetic route, and totally devote themselves to service to creator, and don't really do anything with humans or for their own self good. But yeah, so you're basically free to choose, because you have this free will. You're basically free to choose whatever you want in that way, is that you can basically pick which levels of stratified identity you want to serve. And the idea ultimately is to balance all of those in a way that is advantageous to how we ought to evolve and have this kind of teleological self-actualization, where you're helping all of those different levels. But you can certainly work against your own interests. There are people who are very much self-sabotaging and have these negative characteristics.
Yeah, so one thing that interests me with this idea of self-determinism is addictions, because there you have an idea of enslaving yourself. I was wondering if CTMU reflects at all on that.
Yeah, I think that the way that CTMU probably would conceptualize addictions is as a tell-on. So it's not something that is abridging your free will per se, but it's something that you kind of voluntarily signed up for, whether or not you knew it, by taking, whatever substance or activity it is that you're addicted to. And then and then basically what happens from there is that you are then basically enslaved by this higher metaphysical drive, which is literally, the substance that you are addicted to. So I think that there is a model for abrogation of free will in the same way that there is for those who are addicted to money or powers, that there is a telon that is set up that they're subscribed to, and they subscribe to that because they want, pleasure or fun time or whatever, but they're actually giving up a portion of their free will. And oftentimes, it takes a very heroic effort to overcome an addiction for that reason, is because you're not entirely in control of it. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just means that it can sometimes be very difficult, and you have to kind of overcome yourself in order to do that.
Yeah, that's insightful.
All right, I think we'll wrap up soon if no one else has any other cues, and I don't have any other A's. But
I don't want to keep too much of your time. I don't want to bore everyone with my questions, but
Oh no,
go
of course. I
anyone
want
else.
many more questions, but
Fair enough. Is there any philosophical attitudes or beliefs which are directly incompatible with the CTMU, or can potentially anything be synthesized?
one of the two thing in Christopher Langan has a video called The Church of Teleology and Multiplex Unity, which was essentially he had an idea back in the 1980s to have this kind of legally incorporated religion of logic and freedom that would be the institutional structure of the CTMU. But there were certain like legal challenges with calling something a church that wasn't really a church, so that was kind of abandoned. But the idea is that it also stands for CTMU, which is kind of cool. But in that video, he talks about how the interviewer asks him if there are any faiths that are incompatible with the CTMU, and basically what he says is that it is this meta-religious framework. But he says, for instance, the religions of Satanism and atheism, because one is denying the ultimate identity of reality, or at least its personal aspects, and also even certain kind of infantile formulations of theism, as I wrote in my book, that kind of ignore this self-programmatic aspect to God. So this is the the ideas of God having like a corporeal form. And I actually am talking about something different from the incarnation here, which is treated differently in the CTMU. But I'm talking about those who believe that God not just became flesh, but is flesh, is like a physical body. But so there are this kind of any version of theism which doesn't include God as the ultimate reality. Basically, any formulation of atheism, unless you define atheism so as to be, so as you define the ultimate reality as not God, which is kind of paradoxical, because that has all of the properties of God and that are traditionally ascribed to in Abrahamic monotheism, including the possibility of relationship. So I'd say, and then obviously Satanism is actively identifying with the adversary of God, and people will kind of say they're doing this facetiously, but even those who are kind of still infecting the culture with like this like symbolism, we're just saying like, haha, I'm a member of the Church of Satan or whatever, are actually basically doing the will of going against God by basically subverting the culture and civilization. Even if they claim to be atheist and not believe in either God or Satan, it's pretty clear whose side they are on, if considering that both of those entities are real. And so I'd say that the CTMU, at least theologically, and there invalidates the kind of a lot of traditional formulations of monotheism, in terms of like God as a physical entity, and also God as a and also atheism and Satanism are my three picks.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. I was thinking more in terms of metaphysical positions. So, Cartesian dualism, for instance, that seems to almost be directly incompatible simply because CTMU is a self-dual system. Or epiphenomenalism, for instance, that seems to directly contradict the idea of self-determinism. But, yeah.
Yeah, there are a number of them. And actually, if you think about it, most philosophical theories are directly at odds with the CTMU, but some notable ones I'd say are atheism, materialism, pretty much all forms of dualism, because the CTMU takes pretty much all of those or most of those and generalizes it to self-duality, to those two things being elements of the same like broader relationship. And solipsism, which says that there's only one perspective on, or that one secondary teller has the entire perspective on reality. Although the CTMU does allow for this distributed solipsism, because at the ultimate level, there is only one perspective on reality, and that is God, and that encompasses all of these other finitary perspectives. Other than that, I mean, there are a lot. The steady state universe, that the universe is not expanding. Even to some degree, the Big Bang model, because the CTMU kind of suggests something similar to the Hawking-Hartle no boundary proposal, that there's a distributed creation point. There is like this global intention of God to create reality, but that didn't happen at any particular point in time. It happens at every point in space and time. So there's a lot. I'd also say most ideas of like moral relativism or ethical relativism, or moral relativism, philosophical relativism, cultural relativism, are all disproven by the CTMU, because it says that there is actually an absolute standard of goodness and truth against which things can be compared. I think that's a pretty good set of things.
Is the unbound telesis, is that characterized as indeterminate or not?
What do you mean by indeterminate?
In terms of the sense formulated in this segment here.
So I would say that that's kind of predeterminate, is that it is undifferentiated, unpotentiated, basically abstract ontic potential. And you kind of have to almost like wear kid gloves while you're kind of discussing this concept, because any conceptualization of um of that unbound telesis is ultimately binding it within your cognitive and perceptual syntax. So there's the first step is to realize that there is no concept, is that this is the literal essential basis of reality, which is beyond human comprehension, and is this kind of infinite expansive energy / light that precedes everything in the world, but it's not the same as anything in our world. So you can't really, because everything that we interact with or even conceive of is bound. So you kind of have to think about it in a very abstract way. But it's not random and it's not determined, because it doesn't really fit into either of those. It then acts on itself through its binding to become self-determinate, but in its unbound phase, it's still predeterminate. It is, and the way it determines itself is obviously through itself, because there's nothing external to it.
Right, okay. So because the self-determinacy is already there in the potential, it can't even be characterized as indeterminate.
Yeah.
I came in late. Uh, I didn't want to ask this earlier, but could you give a brief synopsis of maybe, because I've already read the segment, but is there anything new that you covered during the lesson?
Yeah, and I can also, if you'd like, send you my notes on this, or this will also be published, of course, as all the other ones are. Basically, the idea, I think the most important thing that we covered was this idea of intrinsic self-determinacy, which says that the effect of our choice is moved within the cause that we are self-modeling, and thus our choices are internal to us, they're not externally determined. And then we kind of applied that to the entire universe, is that the whole universe has this self-generative freedom. And this is probably stuff that you know, but and then that inheres within its human tellers, and that means it doesn't need a blueprint or pre-existing laws to bring itself into existence. It programs itself using this like generalized utility that is included within itself. And so then the system is able to basically attribute meaning and existence to itself, and thus kind of do this like broader thing where it's creating, explaining, and sustaining itself. And so that's why this actually has to be presented before the like reality principle or metaphysical ontology principle, is that that freedom is basically the essential basis of reality, is that everything is basically the limit of the viewpoint. And I talked about this kind of 3-point argument, which I've actually thought about as almost an argument in the past against Calvinism. But you can also kind of think about it as an argument just for free will, is that God, the global operator's scripture, the God of ultimate reality, is externally undetermined and entirely free. Nothing external to God determines God's choices, because that would limit God's creative power and freedom. Human tellers are made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore human tellers are free. I think that's pretty robust. I don't see any problem with it from its premises, because I don't see how something can be free and then something that is a basically encoded image of it not be free. But that's pretty much what we talked about, is why we have to have this freedom, and what actually, and how that freedom actually structures and shapes reality, and why reality has to take the shape of an environment for free telic operators.
Okay, great. Sounds good. Giovanni asked a question in the chat.
Oh yeah, what is the process of choice? So that's, I'm going to take that as like kind of at the human level. Tree is that basically what's going on with choice is that there is a thought in there is like a thought in the mind. This is something that I have notes on that Christopher Langan talked about, is that there you can have these impulses which achieve cognitive emergence, and those are actually not really within your control. They are to some extent. You can definitely polarize your mind towards more being service to self thoughts or more being service to other thoughts, and that takes like moral training. But basically, you have thoughts, and these are impulses, desires, ideas, and so forth. And you can have an evil impulse, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're evil, because then you have what's in your mind, called Christopher Langan literally calls the telic editors, that you have ends and purposes, and you can take that thought and be like, no. But if you don't immediately dismiss that thought, you're going to start to fancy it. You're going to start to like that thought, and it will grow on you, and eventually you might give in to that impulse. And carrying it to the behavioral level is much, much worse. So Langan says, each of us has a telic editor which screens the thoughts that are realized in our minds. He says, and in biblical terms, and I really like this passage, it says, thoughts and impulses are elements of the set of attributions instantiating knowledge of good and evil, the fruit of the tree from which Eve allegedly ate at the serpent's behest. The editor is not infallible, but through CTMU parameterized ethical metacognition, thinking about our ethical thinking, we can know when our telic editor is malfunctioning and perform resets as might be necessary. So you actually need rigorous moral training, and you need not necessarily the CTMU, but at the very least a CTMU consistent moral system. So that's why it doesn't really work to have these things, or at least in most cases, to have these things like atheism or moral relativism, because these are against CTMU and therefore against truth and goodness. So we need to basically, it's not necessarily always our faults, our minds and emotions and complexes, but as proven by this, we do actually have free will. We are not, the effect is not something outside of ourselves, but actually the effect of our choices in the CTMU is moved within the cause. We are both the cause and the effect of our existence, and we therefore have total responsibility for all of our thoughts, actions, and behaviors. So basically the process of choice is we get an impulse and and then it goes through that telic editor, which is that being within that being that is the telic editor is us, and we, the telic editor, have free choice. We can choose either to give into the impulse, and we've all had this thing where it's total free choice. It's a total, this point where you can do, where there's like this bifurcation where you can either give in, you not. So the process of get that impulse, screen it through the and get to make a choice about it. It's not super hot, and we pretty much all know what it's like to make a choice.
I've just started reading the segment back. There's one part which I remember when I read this the first time, I didn't properly understand. Langen says, this defines a situation in which the true temporal identity of the system is a distributed point of temporal equilibrium that is both between and inclusive of past and future. In this sense, the system is timeless or atemporal. Is that just in reference to telic recursion, or is that atemporality also stratified down to us as agents?
Not quite. Basically, what that's talking about is, again, this intrinsic self-determinacy, and that's in that string of passages, is that the effect is basically moved within the cause itself. So, and that applies to the reality system as a whole. So reality exists logically prior to its creation as kind of this, again, this unbound telesis, this infinite unbound potential for a universe that then configures itself. And the reason and what extracts out that true and good order out of that primordial chaos is basically this generalized utility, is this drive for self-recognition and this like feedback between syntax and state, whereby their two are mutually refining one another to maximize this parameter that reality sets for itself, which is basically, you can think of it like its score, is that reality sets like a metric and then it's trying to maximize its score over time. And its score is that generalized utility, which is the teleology of the system. And so that means that teleology is actually programming reality, and that's how it brings itself into existence, is that reality is an identification operator that brings itself into existence through that space where it's extracting out order from that infinite unbound primordial chaos. So that means that reality doesn't come in, and it has to extract out time and space along with that as well. So that means that the process by which reality creates itself and brings itself into existence is a distributed point of temporal equilibrium. I've called that a distributed creation point. Reality doesn't come into existence at any discrete moment in time, but has a distributed origin point that distributes over every point in space and time. And the process by which it does that is called telic recursion, is this constant telic feedback between syntax and state for the maximal utility, the maximal value of reality. So the sense in which the system, the reality system, is timeless or atemporal is that sense in which it brought time itself into existence and therefore can't be defined or constricted by those categories.
But in its self-configuring, is it not restricting itself to temporality?
So the terminal domain and the particular universe in which we find ourselves is constrained by temporality. But that's basically another effect of the limit of the viewpoint, is that it's relative to is that with respect to cognition, space is infinite, but then with respect to perception, it is backwardly finite. It is kind of programming itself through the observer participants. And this is what we'll talk about next week with John Wheeler and his idea of the participatory universe, is that basically what's happening is that reality is kind of, it becomes space-time through the self-representation of its freedom, is that it's trying to create a suitable habitat almost for its secondary images. And so the structure of reality is also basically parameterized to bring about like memory and consciousness. And that means that there has to be this kind of entropy where things become more disordered over time. Which is only true in the terminal domain. In the non-terminal domain, they actually become more ordered over time, in a process that's sometimes called neg entropy, which is negative entropy. And there also has to be this like temporal succession. And I don't know exactly how to explain this like psychologically or neuroscientifically of like where like but like Heidegger talks about this with like and I'm gonna butcher this, but as like the facticity of time, is that we are kind of thrown into this temporal world and it feels like something for time to go on, is that there is a definite experience from one moment to the next. I don't know how to actually connect, and maybe this is something that you could help me with, how to connect that psychological experience of time with that like absolute mathematical time that is how reality kind of, that is basically the track on which reality hurls. It's like a self-generative track that like you can think of the time as the track and space as the train, and that the track is actually that time is actually generating the track um on the fly inwardly within reality. So it's basically the so time is basically the programming domain and space is basically the display domain of reality. But I don't know how that time relates to like psychological time.
Yeah, personally, I find temporality to be the hardest topic in philosophy. Uh, I suppose it's a bit easy when you're just talking about your own experience. The first thing that comes to mind with this idea of, from our perspective, we're almost like the universe shrinking rather than the universe expanding. Uh, that reminds me of what Kierkegaard says. He says, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. There's a sense in our experience where because our own thinking is always a form of participation, our thought is always temporally moving us forward.
Yeah. Was that the end of the question or?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay.
I think I lagged out or something.
Oh, okay. So there's basically I like that quote, is that kind of you have to is that the experience is somehow integrally tied to memory, is that maybe the but I think that there is a real experience of the present, and in some sense if you quantize reality in terms of this logical and experiential self-identification, all that there is the present coming from these many different viewpoints. So I think that there's a lot to unpack there. I'll probably do like a more in-depth analysis, I suppose, when I read Being in Time, but by Heidegger, and do like a interpretation of that. But yeah, I think that there are a lot of interesting and complex questions that are raised by time in our, and really what we're talking about now is not really time in the absolute sense, but actually like phenomenology of what is it like to experience. And that's something that's really hard to talk about because just like with unbound telesis, the experience itself is, when it's grasped within that cognitive and perceptual syntax, it's actually no longer an experience, it's been registered. So you have to kind of live in that space in between when you think about something and when you experience it. And it's kind of hard to do that theoretically. You just kind of have to like experience life.
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing that I was thinking about is I know we're kind of talking about that medium between UBT and bound telesis, or rather how that unfolds. But you would kind of assume a uniformity in the way we experience time. Like I'm sure there isn't much uh direct differentiate. Well, Well, there isn't much. It's not that idiosyncratic, our experience of time. Like I would assume there is at least a fundamental level of uniformity between all of our experiences of time.
Yeah, I think I think that it's probably true that it is not like fundamentally different for other secondary tellers, like what time is like to experience, at least at like our level of complexity. But I'm not sure about that. The
Yeah, I mean, dogs have different sense of time, don't they?
Yeah, but yeah, so Langan talks about this a little bit in the quantum metamechanics paper of that the um of Heisenberg talks about potentiae, which he's quote stand in the middle between the idea of an event and an actual event, a strange kind of physical reality just in the middle between possibility and reality. And aside from the term physical, I think that that kind of describes what we're talking about is that there's like a tiny is that it's that space on the border of and on the boundary of unbound and bound telesis at which lies phenomenal the heart of experience basically, and also the operative connection between potential and between potency and act within reality. So I think that that is fundamental, and that's why it's kind of resonant with a lot of people when they say, you know, the present is all there is. You know, that's kind of true because every moment is kind of sequenced through the present and the sequence and the state transition syntax of how, you know, reality is unfolding. Langen says in CTMU terms, Heisenberg's quantum potentiae coincide with tertiary syntax. I don't think this is exactly what we're talking about. But I don't think I really have a good understanding of phenomenology or experience. But, yeah.
Have you read much of philosophy of science at all?
Not too much. I have a number of like probably a decent portion of the books that I have on my list are kind of philosophy of science. But I haven't gotten around to reading a ton of those. I read last year Cosmology, which is by Edward Harrison, which is very good, which gets like really deep into like the philosophy behind all of that, and that's one of the ones that's recommended by Christopher Langan. Also, this wasn't really science, but also a history of Western philosophy by Bertrand Russell is very good. That's kind of a introduction to thought.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking in terms of you familiar with Kuhn? I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right.
It doesn't ring a bell.
Scientific paradigms, incommensurability of scientific theories. Fair enough.
No, I don't think so.
But isn't the cognitive theoretic model sort of the universal cognition? So almost it becomes a fundamental aspect, and then time is just how it appears in the human cognitive syntax, or what is the? Because I thought basically that consciousness was made more fundamental to all of reality, and so now you don't really have to explain it in terms of the external time of reality. It's more like it's actually intrinsic, and it's the way tellers, it's the way the ultimate reality appears from the point of view of tellers, our own phenomenology of time. Is
Yeah.
it? Am I missing something important, or?
No, I think that that's correct, and that's kind of brings us back to this idea that reality itself does not experience time except from the kind of perspectival experience and logical and experiential self-identification of its secondary tellers. So like so basically yeah, like being and time, not being in the like capital B sense, but being in the sense that Heidegger is talking about it of like Dasein, of like embodied experience, is basically a human experience, but it kind of, I guess what we're talking about is how that experience, how that phenomenon relates to the ultimate general time, which is true of all of reality, as the state transition syntax of the reality self-simulation, which is what time is ultimately.
And I think I don't, in the art of knowing, there's like something called a very brief history of time, and I would need to read again, but I think the idea was like the universe sort of makes the compatibility between the very complex no particle level, all these laws, and then manage to make it so that it works with our very high model of reality, where you can take decisions at our level, and then sort of been designed such that all these processes actually match with that. It's very, I don't know if it's very precise, but I thought it was sort of baked in how everything is occurred, how you can have this low level complexity and our high level observation of the universe is sort of as well baked in how was supposed to work. And so for me, like time is just human cognitive syntax version of time, and then it relates to it sort of organically.
Yeah, I think that from my and I read A Brief History of Time recently as well, is that I think his idea is that there's both this imaginary time, which is kind of this metric that he uses of the square root of -1 times time, so that when you square it, it's just plus t. Instead, you have this manifold. Usually the real manifold is defined as x squared plus y squared plus z squared minus t squared. But if you multiply the time variable by the square root of -1, which is our definition of an imaginary number, and then square that, then you get back to a manifold of x squared plus y squared plus z squared plus t squared. And that's how you get this Hawking-Hartle no boundary proposal, where you can kind of square off and round out all of the gravitational singularities and have this closed manifold that is totally self-contained and brings itself into existence. And the CTMU is actually, that's kind of half of the CTMU. The other half is John Wheeler's participatory universe, and then there's some intermediate logical structure as well. But what Hawking says basically has a totally different explanation between that imaginary time, that mathematical time, and psychological time. Is for psychological time, he basically says that our brain experiences time as entropy, as disorder. And so that means that the increasing, I think that part of I think that's a partially true explanation. I don't think that's completely true, because I don't think it really explains anything. But I think that it's true that if entropy were not the way it were, then our experience and memory also probably wouldn't work. But I'm not sure about that, and I'm not sure why that's so.
Is it even worth referring to that general time as time to begin with?
I mean, usually what it's talked about is as state transition syntax, but I mean, objectively, like, we do treat, even in regular just day of life discourse, people say, let's do something in 60 seconds, and that has a meaning that is at least isomorphic. At least there is a relationship between that and between our experience of the world, is that longer durations of time feel longer on average. There are some exceptions, but but yeah, I think that I don't think that we should be give up on finding a possible connection between those two things, because ultimately they have to be connected. One is this experiential self-identification, and the other is the state transition syntax of reality. And what the CTMU says is that what reality is evolving towards at every new state is the identification. And so if we are implicated in how reality unfolds, then we must have, I think that they really know how to properly formulate that, or even know what that would be, that connection.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be the case that our experiential sense of time is very much related to our own intentionality. So the way we function in the world and our different interests and the way we allocate our attention really defines our experience of time. And so continuity can be created between our intentions and God's, of course. And in that way, we can have almost the same. We can have an isomorphic experience of time that is to the actual to the general sense, like if you measure a period of if you measure time,
Yeah. And I believe, yeah, I think that we're going to wrap this up pretty soon. But I believe that probably the self-duality, formerly mathematical metaphysics on YouTube, I believe has, I'm not sure, but I believe has a series on like CTMU phenomenology, and has probably thought more so about this than I have. I'm not sure about that. But yeah, amazing. Well, thank you to everyone who came. Have a good night. Take care. Do well.
Is this gonna be recorded, or was it recorded? So I can look back.
Yeah, it's all recorded and it will be posted to my YouTube and Substack.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, guys. Have a good night.